Hello, I am Tara Blank, and I will be your presenter today for the course entitled Breaking Barriers: Social Equity Within the Supply Chain. In this course, the participant will discover how to address social equity in the supply chain as it applies to the LEED Social Equity Pilot credits. We will discuss ways to think about social equity, the goals and focus of the supply chain credit, and the specific criteria and documentation required to achieve this credit. The learning objectives of this course are: describe strategies that address social equity issues within the supply chain. Identify the intent and requirements of the social equity within the supply chain pilot credit. Compare social equity and social equality. And explain why human rights and fair trade are important issues within the supply chain. The USGBC launched social equity LEED credits in 2014 to fulfill its organizational goal of using green buildings to enhance the lives of all people in all buildings. The credits have been designed to address social equity from the perspective of everyone who is touched or impacted by a building, including the building's construction workers, designers, engineers, and other project team members, its surrounding community, and those involved in the building's materials supply chain. The 3 new social equity credits are part of the LEED Pilot Credit Library, a system that lets USGBC test and refine credits before they're brought into the rating system. The credits were designed and created by the LEED Steering Committee's Social Equity Working Group. Each credit can contribute 1 point to a project. Varying types of social equity and their associated definitions and perspectives will be relevant for different desired outcomes. Social equity within the supply chain, which is focused on human rights and fair trade. Social equity within the community, which is focused on the way the community interacts with and is affected by the building. Social equity within the project team, which is focused on good pay and professional development for construction workers, as well as corporate social responsibility. Our presentation today will focus on social equity within the supply chain. The overarching intention of the 3 social equity pilot credits is to encourage any and all members of the project team to promote and further social equity by integrating strategies that address identified social, community, and economic needs and disparities among those affected by the project and working on the project. The pilot credits are only available for new construction projects that are seeking certification through the LEED for Building Design and Construction, or BD+C, rating systems. There are many different kinds of social equity to be considered: racial, economic, health, environmental. We'll start by looking at Multnomah County in Oregon, where the city of Portland is located, as an example of how the county supports social equity by continuous improvement on developing workforce diversity. Multnomah County has committed itself to providing equal opportunity and encourages minorities, women, and emerging small business firms and disadvantaged business enterprises to compete for contracting opportunities. Multnomah County's definition of racial equity includes fair and just distribution of resources and opportunities for individuals, culturally specific business, and CBOs, or community-based organizations, and economic and social systems that are sustainable and that sustain all people. Meaningful engagement of communities of color in planning, decision-making, and evaluation that support shifts in perception, paradigm, and demonstrated values. Authentically embodying and leading with racial equity and empowerment principles, including transformative and non-traumatizing practices in planning, decision-making, implementation, and evaluation. And bold and courageous long-term commitment to unearthing racism's root causes and addressing barriers to racial equity in and between individuals, institutions, and systems.
So social equity is understanding how whatever we do has an impact on community and who in the community is impacted and how. Years ago, people started talking about triple bottom line, right? So you're looking at your financial bottom line, and you also are adding the bottom line. It could be the bottom line around the environmental costs. So social equity says, what are the community costs? How does what we do impact community? Equity goes beyond the idea of diversity. Diversity is numbers. Inclusion is the quality of that diversity. Equity looks at the policies, the procedures, the practices, and how that impacts everybody, particularly historically marginalized folk. So, in this country, basically the culture has been built for the dominant culture, which it is in any culture, right? And in this country, the laws and everything else were built around the dominant culture being white, male, heterosexual, cisgendered, Christian. That's just who it was built for. But that's not who we are. We have women, we have African Americans, we have Latinos, we have rich communities of immigrants, and so we really are more than just those things.
Social equity implies fair access to livelihood, education, and resources, full participation in the political and cultural life of the community, and self-determination in meeting fundamental needs. As Martin Luther King Jr. observed, where there is injustice for one, there is injustice for all. Social equity is the cornerstone of society, which cannot be maintained for a few at the expense of the many. When some are excluded or lack the knowledge, income, equipment, or training necessary to participate fully in public discourse, they must overcome obstacles to access in order to ensure fairness. In other words, fairness also demands remedies to redress historic injustices that have prevented or diminished access in the first place. Social equality in a society is the social state of affairs whereby all the people in the society have equal rights under the law, including the right to vote, physical security, freedom of speech and assembly, and the right to own property and to protect it. In addition to that, social equality also includes concepts of economic equity, that is, equal access to education, healthcare, social securities, public infrastructure, and starting and running a business or organization. It also includes equal opportunities for employment. One way to think about these 3 lead pilot credits is the proximity of the people impacted. Supply chain issues usually impact people on a global scale. Community issues impact people on a neighborhood or regional scale. Project team issues impact people working on the project and their families. So let's start with the credit addressing the furthest reaching impacts, social equity within the supply chain. The use of materials in the construction of the project has profound impacts on many people across the globe. This credit is all about the life cycle impact of materials and supplies that are going into your project. So let's ask, When is the best time to start planning for social equity within the supply chain? A, right at the beginning, when you are forming your design team. B, after design plans have begun, but before specifying materials. C, after construction is complete, but pre-occupancy. Or D, after at least 1 year of occupancy. Obviously, since we're discussing the supply chain, the answer is B, before specifying any materials. So let's examine the intent for the lead pilot credit social equity within the supply chain in more detail. The intent states, encourage any and all members of the project team to promote and further social equity by integrating strategies that address identified social and community issues, needs, and disparities among those affected by the project by promoting fair trade, respect for human rights, and other equity practices among disadvantaged communities. Creating more equitable, healthier environments for those affected by manufacturing of the materials created for the project.
So the movement toward fair trade has been very important, I think, for the social equity movement. Fair trade is based on the principle that the people who do the work, the people who produce the product, should share in the benefits of the financial gain from those products. So instead of, if you see fair trade coffee, that means the people who grow the coffee, the people who work on the coffee farm, they're being paid living wages. And that they get to share in some of that profit sharing. Because there's been, a long history of sort of paying people, pennies to do work in impoverished countries and then bringing the product to the United States, and the markup, all that profit goes to the people who do the distribution, who suddenly own the product in a wealthier country. So fair trade is really important in that way. And I think fair trade is reflected, we kind of think about it in terms of things like fair trading for coffee or different things from other countries. But I think when we think about social equity in this country, we can think about fair trade as, living wages for the people who are working in our business, whatever that is. If we're doing green building, whatever we're doing, and thinking about, if we're building buildings with solar panels, thinking about who's building those solar panels. Is everybody being treated well and justly all the way along the supply line? So going through and thinking, what's the goal? What are we doing? Who's impacted? How are they impacted? Can we remove barriers? Can we provide the opportunity to close the disparities?
When you're starting to specify different materials and evaluating your options for suppliers and manufacturers, think about this. Who can you contract with to help promote fair trade and basic human rights? How will you assess their behaviors and policies? Suppliers and manufacturers should not discriminate on the basis of an individual's race, religion, color, sex, ethnicity, citizenship status, age, sexual orientation, or other such characteristics. Suppliers and manufacturers should also encourage a more gender-balanced workplace, with women being given the same opportunities for recruitment, hiring, training, promotion, and leadership positions as are presented to men. Companies need to provide safe and healthy work environments for employees and to advance safety and health management systems for the benefit of all employees.
So when you think about how power is distributed, we know in our culture power has been distributed to more benefit to white, straight, Christian, heterosexual males, right? That's the construct, which does not make those folks bad, right? It just means that we need to think carefully about not only the moral reasons that we need to think about people's human rights and how we need to distribute that power and that benefit, but also about what are we missing, right? What do we miss in terms of what people can bring to the conversation? So human rights are critical, and I think that again, when you think about how you do business, it's about being thoughtful. I think that equity is basically a critical thinking exercise, and it comes down to who is benefited and how, and who's burdened and how. Sometimes people are hesitant to think about, they think cost is the bottom line. And that's why social equity has to be put into your triple bottom line. When we think about the environmental movement, I think that's really critical to think about. A lot of the building of the sustainability movement came from early investment, right, that seemed very costly originally. In Portland, I thought it was very interesting as sustainability movement began to take hold. One of the things, somebody did something called the green dividend, where they were able to create a formula, an economic formula to say, it may cost more in the initial investment to build this building, but these are the savings over time, right? And so I think you have to think the same way about social equity, which means thinking about human rights. So human rights, I think, gives us the moral argument, and I don't use moral in a religious term. I use it in a secular term of our responsibility and accountability as human beings to each other, how we treat each other.
Now let's discuss the requirements for this LEED credit. This credit addresses social equity for those involved in the production of materials and products used in the project, including the stages, raw materials extraction, processing, manufacturing, and assembly of final components and products. Projects must use permanently installed products from at least 10 different manufacturers that meet one of the following criteria: Supplier Assessment or Code of Conduct. Permanently installed building products are defined as products and materials that create the building or are attached to it. If furniture is included in the MR credit calculations, it may also be included in this credit. Some specific products that are part of MEP systems but are passive, meaning not part of the active portions of the system, may be included in credit calculations. This allows flexibility for the optional assessments of piping, pipe insulation, ducts, duct insulation, conduit, plumbing fixtures, faucets, shower heads, and lamp housings. Special equipment such as elevators, escalators, process equipment, and fire suppression systems are excluded from the credit calculations. Also excluded are products purchased for temporary use on the project, like formwork for concrete. The Supplier Assessment and Code of Conduct both address, at a minimum, no child, forced, or bonded labor, health and safety procedures and training, right of freedom of association, non-discrimination, discipline, harassment, and grievance procedures, fair working hours and compensation, anti-corruption and bribery. Both options require executive-level signatures or third-party verification for both suppliers and manufacturers. Both options require that each assessment or code of conduct must be signed by the CEO or CFO of the qualifying supplier company, or the CEO or CFO's designee, or must be verified by a third party. So let's look at option 1, the supplier assessment, in greater detail. Establish and distribute supplier assessments or scorecards, which may include self-assessments, and document return of completed assessments from Tier 1 suppliers or suppliers further up the supply chain, comprising 75% of each manufacturer's total direct material spent for a consecutive 12-month period within the previous 2 years. Qualifying assessments must be from the manufacturer's Tier 1 suppliers directly responsible for extraction of raw materials or the processing, manufacturing, subassembly of materials and products in the manufacturer's supply chains. Brokers, distributors, and inventory management providers to the manufacturer are not counted towards the credit. However, assessments may be passed through them to qualifying suppliers. The USGBC website provides some excellent tools and resources for this pilot credit. The USGBC lists 2 tools that can be used to complete a compliant supplier assessment. The first tool that we'll explore is the Global Compact Self-Assessment tool, which is designed for use by all company sizes and sectors who are committed to upholding social and environmental standards in their operations. The tool can be used to help companies identify due diligence processes needed at the level of each right, including tailored key performance indicators for evaluating company policy, company procedures, and company performance. The assessment tool unpacks the substantive content of what it means for a business to respect each human right through business-relevant questions and indicators. The tool consists of 45 questions with a set of 3 to 9 indicators for each question. The Global Compact Self-Assessment tool is just that, a self-assessment. Participants decide where to start, how much time to invest, and what to do with the outcome. The Global Compact Assessment tool is free to download and use. The tool is an Excel spreadsheet with a list of questions, comments, and follow-up actions. At the bottom, we can see an Introduction tab with instructions, and then the major category tabs such as Management, Human Rights, Labor, Environment, and Anti-Corruption. Tier 1 suppliers would complete these assessments and return them back to you. As we noted earlier, qualifying assessments must be from the manufacturer's Tier 1 suppliers directly responsible for extraction of raw materials or the processing, manufacturing, or subassembly of materials and products in the manufacturer's supply chains. If we look at the Management tab, the questions here pertain to regulatory compliance, worker involvement, and grievance mechanisms. The human rights questions concern health and safety systems, protective equipment and training, wages, sick leave, and so on. And as we can see, the other categories are about labor, the environment, and anti-corruption, and help qualify this tool for option 1 of the credit. Project teams are encouraged to research the tool in greater detail to assist their suppliers. For option 1, the USGBC website also provides the Supplier Self Assessment Questionnaire by Ceres. Ceres is a nonprofit organization advocating for sustainability leadership, and its goal is to mobilize a powerful network of investors, companies, and public interest groups to accelerate and expand the adoption of sustainable business practices and solutions to build a healthy global economy. The Supplier Self-Assessment Questionnaire by Ceres is a valuable tool in any supply chain sustainability program. The tool can help companies evaluate, manage, and communicate their environmental, social, and governance impacts, as well as policies, practices, and performance. The tool, which is basically a PDF questionnaire, is free to download from the USGBC website. So let's take a brief look at the Supplier Self-Assessment Questionnaire. Tier 1 suppliers are asked a series of questions. For example, in the social section, suppliers are asked about whether the facility has policies that prohibit forced labor and child labor. Does the facility have policies that cover harassment and abuse, vacation and leave time, and wages? Does the facility have in place a management system to assess labor, health, and safety risks? Another section in the questionnaire asks suppliers about discrimination. Does the facility have written policies in place for its hiring, salary, benefits, termination practices to prevent discrimination on the basis of age, gender, nationality, race, religion, and sexual orientation? Does the facility have procedures in place to ensure employees receive equal pay for equal work? The form is straightforward and should be an effective method to determine a supplier's environmental, social, and governance impacts. Now let's discuss option 2, Code of Conduct. The credit requirements state, document completion and acceptance of a supplier code of conduct based on criteria from an internationally recognized social responsibility guideline or standard by Tier 1 suppliers comprising at least 50% of each manufacturer's total direct materials spent for a consecutive 12-month period within the previous 2 years. Qualifying Tier 1 suppliers are those that are directly responsible for the extraction of raw materials or the processing, manufacturing, or subassembly of materials and products in the manufacturer's supply chain. Brokers, distributors, and inventory management providers to the manufacturer again are not counted toward the credit. However, assessments may be passed through them to qualifying suppliers. This code of conduct must address the total supply chain, and the Tier 1 suppliers must require those in their supply chains to comply with this code. The USGBC website again offers tools to complete option 2 of the credit. One of the freely downloadable tools is a checklist for the required elements for the supplier code of conduct. This checklist provides a tool for reviewing and evaluating completeness of a supplier code of conduct and compliance with requirements of the LEED pilot credit, social equity in the supply chain option 2. The company sponsoring the code of conduct should complete this form. It will then be used in reviewing the code for completeness. It is not necessary for the code of conduct to use the language provided in this checklist. However, it is necessary for the code of conduct to address each of the specific elements of the requirements. As we can see at the bottom of the checklist, topics such as child labor and forced labor must be addressed in the supplier code of conduct. In addition, the USGBC website provides another useful tool for suppliers to help with the credit under option 2. The USGBC website has a free template available for suppliers to create their own code of conduct. The template has sections on the various issues that need to be addressed, such as no child labor, health and safety procedures, non-discrimination, right of freedom of association, and other principles. Your supplier's willingness to adopt your supplier code of conduct may depend on the degree to which you consulted your suppliers during the development of the supplier code of conduct, the volume of products that you order from each supplier, and the demands of your supplier's other customers in this area. So let's recap the documentation for the supplier assessment and code of conduct, which are nearly identical. Let's see what's required to document achievement of this credit. For each manufacturer, a spreadsheet that lists all Tier 1 suppliers, spending for each supplier or the percentage of total, indication of whether or not the supplier has submitted the signed assessment, total spending for calculating 75% of the total, and 5 signed assessment documents that address criteria listed in the credit. Additional assessments may be requested. And the manufacturer's signed assessment document for option 1 and the manufacturer's signed code of conduct if you pursue option 2. Another method for both option 1 and 2 is for each manufacturer to submit documentation of certification under the ANSI BIFMA E3-2014E Furniture Sustainability Standard, including achievement of Section 8.7.2.1, plus submittal of a manufacturer policy on freedom of association. The ANSI-BIFMA E3 Furniture Sustainability Standard was developed by a joint committee of stakeholders using a consensus process described by the American National Standards Institute. The purpose of this voluntary standard is to provide measurable market-based definitions of progressively more sustainable furniture by establishing performance criteria that address environmental and social aspects throughout the supply chain. It addresses product-based characteristics in the general areas of materials, energy usage, human and ecosystem health, and social responsibility impacts. The standard was designed to allow for multiple levels of achievement and to provide an open alternative to proprietary protocols. Finally, the social equity within the supply chain pilot credit can also be achieved by another program approved by USGBC. However, at this time, there are no other options that are approved by the USGBC.
Sam Adams, who was the mayor here, who did a lot of work on sustainability when he was a mayor and a commissioner, and he used to talk about the work we do on equity being like the work we did in sustainability. I mean, I remember the days when the big investment was a disconnector downspout project out of the Office of Neighborhood Involvement. Then we ended up with a bureau, and now the bureau has been integrated with planning, right? And people would not think of going to city council for approval on a project without being really ready to talk about what the environmental impacts are. It is just the known value. So that's what I love to think about, that we'll get to the point where social equity, who we're impacting and how we embrace who's in our community and who we nurture, that becomes second nature to us.
This concludes our presentation. Green CE is the industry's leading provider of no-cost continuing education. Whether you're an architect, engineer, contractor, or a paradigm-shifting sustainability strategist, we've got you covered. Green CE offers free GBCI courses, free LEED-specific hours, and free webinars to maintain your credential. Are you the only LEED professional in your company? Are you tired of being the one who gets the LEED-related phone calls and emails while your buddies are playing golf or surfing in Bora Bora? Well, those days are over. Green CE will train your entire staff to become LEED professionals for free. That's right. From your billionaire CEO to your part-time janitor, our free LEED exam prep program will train your team to become LEED ninjas. So what are you waiting for? Visit greence.com today.